Hey everybody, hope you can hear me. Back for some more literature reviews here. I have a very interesting article, Transcend, or let me see here, Transcendent, hard to say that, Transcendent Spirituality and Psychological Flexibility Among Adults on the Autism Spectrum in the United States. So, we're going to talk a lot here about spirituality, autism spectrum disorder, and how all of these come together in terms of understanding mental health across neurodivergent, neurodevelopmental disorders. So, first things first, what is autism spectrum disorder? I'm going to go ahead and switch here to the DSM and we'll go over the criteria together. Then we'll look at another article that talks about the neuroscience of autism spectrum disorder. And then finally, we'll get into that main article where they essentially looked at a combination of spirituality and beliefs and practices among autism spectrum disorder and what individuals with such a disorder find for mental health when they do or do not engage in spiritual practices. All right, so let me switch over here to the DSM. Hang on one second. Okay, there we go. So for those of you who do not know, let me remember the page here, 155. This is the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, fifth edition, text revision, DSM-5 TR. This is basically the Bible or the main textbook that we use within mental health fields to understand mental health diagnoses as well as diagnosing them. You will also see other types of manuals that are used, especially in different countries. But as far as the United States goes, this is the primary manual that we use. You will also see ICD codes, International Classification for Diseases, but we'll stick with the DSM here. All right, so this category, here's all the different types of mental health disorders that you'll see. We're going to be looking at neurodevelopmental disorders, and then we're going to go down to autism spectrum disorder, page 155. Okay, here we are. So let's go through this criteria together, and this is just to help make a baseline and a generalized understanding of what this disorder entails in terms of diagnostic criteria. Oftentimes, especially in social media, we hear people talk about autism spectrum symptoms or being autistic or more colloquial terms. But here we want to stick to what we have gathered from evidence and what we have found in terms of a consensus across mental health fields and what we use to formally diagnose and understand autism spectrum disorder. So first things first, autism spectrum disorder involves a variety of neurodevelopmental related issues. Perhaps they're best summarized across the top 3 points here. Deficits in social emotional reciprocity. I'll explain what that means in just a second. Deficits in nonverbal communicative behaviors used for social interaction. I will again explain what that means in just a second. And deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. We also see patterns of, aside from social communication and interaction related issues, we also see patterns of restricted or repetitive patterns of behavior. And we also see things like fixated interests, stereotyped interests. All of these things tend to come together as a cluster. Now, I will say this as well, within the DSM-5, this is where we saw this switch. Now we're in the DSM-5 TR, more of a spectrum view of mental health disorders. And the reason for this is because there's just so many different subtypes for so many disorders. Oh, let me check my microphone here. I want to make sure I set it up with the right microphone. Hang on one second. Okay, I'm having trouble finding that, but that's fine. I'm sure you can hear me. So where did I leave off here? Yes, the spectrum types of disorder. So you'll see this for other types as well: schizophrenia spectrum, cross neurodevelopmental disorders, even depressive disorders. And honestly, every type of disorder, you can make this generalization. It's a bit vague in the sense that we just use the spectrum to encompass the range of functioning across mental health for a certain cluster or category of disorders. But it's also helpful in terms of not having to memorize every single different subtype of a disorder. Before, with autism spectrum disorder, before we had that, there were just many different types. And one of the reasons that it's good to cluster things into a spectrum is because the DSM and mental health diagnoses in general, we are characterizing behavior. We are characterizing how these disorders look in terms of what we can observe and what kinds of behaviors manifest from a person. If you can imagine a neurobiological basis for a mental health disorder, that could involve a lesion to perhaps one part of the brain, but that lesion can manifest as a variety of different behaviors across many different mental disorders. So instead of trying to memorize all of those, we're trying to understand things more from a mechanistic side, right? Instead of looking at 30 different types of autism, what do these all have in common and how do they relate to neurobiological changes within a person so that we can understand the whole as opposed to looking at each individual piece as a fragmented, different type of disorder. Another reason for switching to the spectrum side is that even when you have those fragmented types of disorders, they also can vary in terms of functional impact and how the symptoms manifest across time and within a single time frame. All of those things just indicate there's way too many variables at play here to simply try to memorize many different types. It's quite different from physical medicine in that sense. So autism spectrum disorder, let's go down all the criteria here. Again, A, persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts. This is just like what people would imagine when they think of autism, right? They don't expect normal types of communication. Sometimes you see things that are more nonverbal. To people who jumped in, feel free to ask any questions. You don't have to, it's totally up to you. Limits with social interactions, and this goes both ways, right? It goes both verbal and nonverbal. And the reason for this, we'll get into in the next article, it has to do with, at least to a correlative extent, it has to do with neurobiological changes in terms of how the brain is actually wired and how the brain actually functions. So we will return to that a little bit later. So we need all of the criteria here: deficits in social emotional reciprocity. This is your back and forth ability to communicate. So if you're talking with someone in conversation and you're making the nonverbals, like you really want to get out of there, you really want to phase out of this conversation, can they pick up on those nonverbals, right? Do they understand things in terms of what you're trying to say verbally, nonverbally? Can they maintain back and forth conversation? Those are the kinds of things we're looking at, right? If you're trying to talk to someone about something, but they're instead looking at a bug and they're totally encapsulated by this bug and they don't pick up that you're trying to have a back and forth conversation with them, those are the kinds of issues we might be looking for. Deficits in nonverbal communicative behaviors. So this is what I mentioned before as well. Do they pick up on nonverbal cues? This is often something we are looking at. Do people tend to look at your chin, or do they look down at the ground? Can they maintain eye contact? Can they read nonverbal things like expressing with your hands? Do they pick up on those things, or do they tend to get lost there? Deficits in developing, maintaining, understanding relationships. This is more of a consequence of the other two, right? If you can't really communicate with people, if you can't really interact with them effectively, your chances of having a successful relationship with someone of any kind is going to be much more limited. Oftentimes, we see that such individuals who are diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder or meet criteria, oftentimes their family, that's the only real type of relationship they have with anybody. It might just be family members, and that's because they grew up with the family knows them, they understand the nuances. Strangers aren't really going to understand that as much. And because of that, they're going to just, in social interactions, especially when you're meeting someone for the first time, people tend to be on guard. They tend to be evaluating and judging. And if you can't pick up on those cues, they're going to make judgments about you and probably move on. Okay, we can move on to B here. So, restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interest, or activities is manifested by at least two of the following. So, we have different criteria here, right? Stereotyped or repetitive movements. You can imagine that. I'm sure people have seen individual cases in real life or in movies or whatever of what that might look like. Sometimes they might repeat things that you say in kind of a meaningless fashion, or they engage in repetitive movements. They might be rocking back and forth, different types of things to look there. The context is what matters most on that criterion. Insistence on sameness or inflexible adherence to routines. People I've evaluated in the past, they will have a strict routine down to every 10 minutes, perhaps. And if that routine breaks in any kind of way, they are going to have a meltdown. For some people, it's more serious. For some people, it's less serious. Again, we are on the spectrum here, so there's a wide range of how these criteria will manifest. But generally speaking, they tend to hold to a fixated schedule. And as you can imagine, anxiety might follow because there are times where you can't stick to your schedule no matter how well you plan it. So that's another thing we look for in terms of criteria. Highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus. So whenever I'm seeing individuals, especially if it's an online appointment or something of that nature, I might ask to see their room, because that can really be a cue for what kinds of interests and what kinds of things they hold of value in their life. Their room is kind of like their own personal space, their safe spot where they might go when they're feeling overwhelmed. And I've had cases where someone might be really into Pokemon and their entire room is just decorated top to bottom with Pokemons, and they might have a certain stuffed animal of a certain Pokemon, and that's what they carry with them. They've had it since they were 5 years old. Now they're 25 years old. It's the same stuffed animal. It's completely torn down, it's worn out, it's stained and everything, but they insist on holding on to that stuffed animal. And if you try to take it away, that's going to turn into a tantrum, because again, you are impacting their insistence on the sameness, which is what this criteria is talking about. All right. This one's really important, especially with the next article we get to. Hyper or hyporeactivity to sensory input or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. So again, we're talking about behavioral criteria here. But for this criterion specifically, we will see that there are some pretty close neurobiological correlates, especially because we see that the brain for individuals who are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, there are stronger connections for more localized brain regions and weaker connections for brain regions that are further apart from each other. So, what we see is that the way sensory information is understood or contemplated it differs because the brain is physically connected in a different kind of way. You see this much more in a younger age before other individuals of that same age frame catch up in terms of brain development. We'll return to that one with the next article as well. Symptoms have to have been there from an early developmental period. Again, this is because autism spectrum disorder is a neurodevelopmental disorder. So if you suddenly have symptoms at age 20 and there was no timeline or no other symptoms beforehand, there's probably something else going on, because if the brain is physically wired differently and it's been like that since birth, we know from literature you can start to find differences as early as 6 months in some cases. Then there's probably something else going on. We really should see that pattern across the lifespan, should be stable in terms of the criteria here. This is something that comes up with pretty much every type of mental disorder, not all of them. Symptoms cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of current functioning. So, again, we need to see that aspect of clinically significant distress. Your brain can be wired differently, but if you can get around just fine and you can do everything just fine as well, then are we really looking at a disorder here? Or is this just normal variance within the population, within a person? Okay, and then other rule outs, we don't need to go into these different specifiers here. So hopefully that helps give a basic sense on what autism is. The main takeaway here, autism involves persistent deficits in social communication, social interaction, restricted, repetitive patterns of behaviors and interests, as well as an insistence on sameness and having an inflexible, literal type of approach to things. Those are some of the key criteria to look at here. So I'm going to switch to the second article. Let me see how to do that. Okay, now it's back to me. Okay, there we go. Let me move this on my own window so that we can go through this together. Okay, so this article is from JAMA Psychiatry. I believe it's 2018. So it's not the newest article, but it's also not the oldest one. And the text is kind of small. Let me see if I can minimize this one here. Okay. And what if I do this? Yeah, we'll leave it at that. Okay, so this article is just reviewing clinical neuroscience data for autism spectrum disorder, advances we've had in the field, or fields, I should say. This one is primarily from the perspective of precision psychiatry. To whoever's sitting in, feel free to ask any questions if you'd like. Totally up to you. So I highlighted some of the key points here. I've already been through the article. I thought this was a really interesting point to start off with. So neuroimaging has advanced so much in the past few decades. We've gone from just having nothing in terms of neuroimaging to building up to where the mathematical models are just super effective in terms of correlating brain behavior relationships. So again, this is something I mentioned earlier. Neuroimaging can start to detect differences in children as young as 6 months. That is fascinating, right? Because as early as 6 months, that's telling you, hey, this brain, this person who has autism spectrum disorder, it is already significantly differentiated from what we would see in the normal population in terms of the ways the neurons come together, the ways they migrate, the ways they connect to each other, the ways they prune. We'll go over that. It's a little bit later in the article. Okay, so basically the overall takeaway here is that we're getting better at diagnosing and understanding autism spectrum disorder, but in all truth, we still have a long way to go. We are talking about literal millions to billions, maybe even trillions of variables at play when we're dealing with the brain. There's just so much complexity. It's so difficult. And on top of that, you cannot separate the brain from the environment. We know that epigenetic factors come together as well. We know that the brain and the environment are both interacting with each other, and they're interconnected in such a way that they cannot be separated when you are trying to understand the whole picture of what autism spectrum disorder looks like, or any mental health disorder in general. So I'm not going to go through this entire article. We'll just stick to the main points because this is not the main article I want to talk about. So some of the main things here, genetic risk factors. Again, there's so many here. It's been a while for me, but when I was an undergrad, I worked in a psychiatry lab, computational psychiatry for the field, and we were looking at specific de novo mutations. I'll go over what that is in just a second here. And to the people who are here, feel free to ask any questions if you would like. De novo mutations, yeah, I'll go over that in just a second. But basically, the takeaway here is that autism spectrum disorder, just like many other mental health disorders, they have a very, very heavy biological basis. Okay. as you can imagine, when we talk about behavior, behavior doesn't just come out of nowhere. Behavior is a mixture of both the environment and our genetics interplaying with each other. Behavior does not just come out of nowhere. So when we see that biological basis, that's where we're talking about the correlates. And we also know that biological bases originate from genetics. It's kind of a complex interplay there. We don't need to go in full depth for that. But basically, the takeaway here is that there are many genetic correlates. This de novo mutations basically means like a new type of mutation. It occurs spontaneously. It doesn't necessarily have to be inherited by parents or family members. I believe they have a nice figure here for that. I'll zoom in a little bit. Hopefully that helps for whoever's watching here. So here's an example of inherited genetic risk variants. Again, you can see some red here, and then the red shows up down here. Some have autism, some have no characteristics. Some might have a genetic component, but they don't show the behavioral signs. And again, there's a whole spectrum of variants here. De novo, here's an example. Both parents, everything's grayed out. There's no specific correlates that we know of for autism in this case, but for whatever reason, it shows up as a spontaneous mutation. Again, many different factors can determine spontaneous types of mutations. Could be environmental, could be toxins, could be complications from pregnancy, environmental factors. All of those things come together. Okay, and then there's some other more technical types of mutations or variances that might be involved here. We don't need to get into specific codons and nucleotides and single nucleotide variants. All those things are a little more technical than what I want to go into here. But if you want me to whoever's watching, feel free to ask and we can get into it. Basic takeaway here, genetics play a very, very heavy role for how behavioral signs and autism spectrum disorder can show up, as well as other types of neurodevelopmental disorders. It's kind of like genetics determine the threshold for how a behavior or how functioning can manifest, and then the environmental and lifestyle factors determine where the level of activation is going to be within that set value by the gene. So to help clarify that, somebody might have, and I'm really simplifying here just to help understand, someone might have the genetics to have an IQ score between 85 and 130. If you take that person and you throw them into a super low socioeconomic setting and they grow up and they don't really have proper nutrients, proper education, proper diet, proper parenting, proper care, proper schooling, you're probably going to see IQs that are in the lower range. And then vice versa if you put somebody in a really good type of environment. So again, that variance is not only for single data points, but it is also across the lifespan for a person. Okay. Yeah, again, so this is something similar to what I did before in that computational psychiatry lab. Different types of de novo mutations can contribute to autism spectrum disorder risk, and there seems to be a small subset that can explain a whole lot of variance. Different types of critical genes and not so critical genes are at play. Again, it's a very complicated interplay of factors. Okay, and then on the other side, just like what we always talk about when we discuss psychology, whether you're in an undergraduate class or listening to a lecture from somebody, we always talk about genetics. We always talk about environment. Environment is a huge factor as well, just like I mentioned before. And one of the biggest factors for environmental risk is parental age. I think this is relatively well known, but if it's not, I'll go over it anyways. The older the parents are, the more likely the individual is to have neurodevelopmental disorders, especially autism spectrum disorder, right? We see a very high correlation here, 18%, 20% for every 10 years, right? That's pretty crazy when you think about it. If we're talking about somebody in their early 40s, then yeah, just imagine how much that percentage adds up over time. Here's a picture of some of the key high-risk genes that are at play. Again, this is the culmination of a lot of different research here. And yeah, we don't need to go into it, but a lot of different genes here. You can look at that at your own time if you want. I'll post these articles with the live stream to allow you to look at it at your own time. Okay, prematurity, that's another risk factor. And then let's see here. Yeah, some other factors. We can skip over that. Okay, so here's a nice summary chart here for brain development. This is what I was talking about a little bit earlier. Again, when the brain is developing for individuals, there are tons of different neurons, more neurons than an adult brain has actually, that are trying to figure out where to go. They're trying to figure out how to connect, and they're going to use genetics as a blueprint, but it's also going to be influenced by environmental factors. So you're going to have neural proliferation. You're going to have the neurons that are being formed, and then you're going to have neurons that are dying off, and then you're going to have neurons that are moving. Synapses are being made, they're connecting with each other. The synapses are also going to be pruning. That happens over the lifespan, but especially at younger ages as the brain's first developing. And then myelination. So, how the brain is going to be configured physically is determined at a young age, and it's heavily based in genetics. So, as you can imagine, if there's genetic variances, then that's going to change how the brain wires itself. When the brain wires itself in a different kind of way, you're going to see different types of behaviors. That's what the autism spectrum disorder is trying to classify. It's trying to take all the different variances there and put it into a generalized set of behaviors that we tend to see when you have these types of biological variances within an individual. All right, and as you can see, variances occur both prenatally and postnatally. So both of those are at play, and that's where factors related to pregnancy really come into play as well for how an individual develops. Yeah, this is something else I was mentioning earlier as well. Something I actually didn't know about, and this is new for me. Children who will go on to have autism spectrum disorder show expansion of cortical surface area starting in sensory domains and then followed by more global overgrowth for the first 1 to 2 years. And maybe I'll pull it up here. I'll show you anyways. There are 6 different layers for cortex, and each of these layers, they change in terms of what parts of the brain they are connecting to. So some might go to thalamus, some might connect to other cortical layers, and this all correlates closely to the types of sensory data and how the mind functions in general. I'll skip over it. It's fine. We don't need to go into that. Okay. Let's see here if there's anything else worth mentioning. So yeah, as the individual gets a little bit older, a few years in, brain volumes start to equal out between children with autism spectrum disorder and their peers after 4 years old. And yeah, we can keep going here. So that helps with getting some kind of a baseline here. Main takeaways: DSM-5 criteria for behaviorally what autism spectrum disorder looks like, and then this article for what autism spectrum disorder looks like in terms of development, both from a biological basis and from an environmental basis. Okay, so let's go into the main article now. Hopefully that was enough. Hopefully that was enough backstory there to help to help understand autism. Took half the time. Hopefully people don't mind. All right, I'm going to switch to the main article here. Let me pull that up. Okay, there we go. Yeah, this was a really fascinating article. It's, as far as I know, and I think the article mentions this as well. Oh, hang on. I think I lost it. I think I lost the article. There we go. It's my 3D printer running in the background, if you can hear that. Let me see here. Oh, I think I broke the live stream. Hang on. Let me try to troubleshoot here. Let's see. Maybe if we do window instead. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Yeah, there we go. Okay, now it's working. All right, transcendent spirituality and psychological flexibility among adults on the autism spectrum disorder in the United States. Okay, so as far as I know, this is one of the first studies, if not the first study, to look at aspects of psychological flexibility, spiritual practices, and autism spectrum disorder. Why do we even want to bother looking at autism spectrum disorder for these types of variables? First off, is that individuals do in fact have autism spectrum disorder, and these individuals deserve help just as much as anyone else. And if we understand what these variances can look like in individuals, that also informs how we understand things for the generalized population. So, essentially, what they did for this article was they looked at the association between psychological flexibility, inflexibility, satisfaction of life, spiritual practices, and how all of those vary for individuals with autism spectrum disorder. Again, super fascinating area because, as we know from the diagnostic criteria, individuals with autism spectrum disorder, they tend to understand things in a little bit different of a sense, and the way they understand spiritual aspects is also going to vary similarly. We've talked about acceptance and commitment therapy before, as well as psychological flexibility. If you're interested in hearing more about that, you can check out some of the other videos or live streams, tons of information out there. Fortunately, acceptance and commitment therapy and the psychological flexibility model, both of those can work across diagnoses, right? We're not just looking at a manualized treatment for one specific disorder. We are looking at a therapy that works across individuals and across populations because the foundations of these therapies are not based in disorders, they are based in psychological mechanisms of change. Very, very important key distinction there. This is pretty crucial in terms of what I talk about in this entire channel. Spirituality, spiritual practices, those have a very, very deep impact on mental health. And on top of that, they can alter psychological flexibility components as well, both directions, inflexibility and flexibility. This is where the authors mention it as well. Our knowledge has explored spirituality and psychological flexibility among adults on the autism spectrum, but there's been no other research on this kind of topic before. So we have a chance here to look at something that's pretty cool. We're going to see how do variables between psychological flexibility and spiritual practices differ across autism spectrum disorder. A lot of background information on autism spectrum disorder, logical flexibility, and spirituality. We can skip over those. But I do want to spend a little bit of time here on spirituality in adults on the autism spectrum. We tend to see decreased amounts here, and perhaps that's not surprising given how non-literal spiritual practices are. But again, there's variance within that autism spectrum. And in this case, when we do see adults on the autism spectrum who engage in spiritual practices, they also find certain amounts of benefit as well. There's just not as many. You tend to see decreased amounts there. And you also tend to see more of what we call secular spiritual practices. So the way we might differentiate secular and transcendent spiritual practices, transcendent involves more of a supernatural component, secular does not. Okay. Yeah, we can skip over some of these other things. Spirituality remains important, just like I mentioned before. And then for psychological flexibility, mental health, and spirituality, again, there seems to be a close relationship here between all three of these. Now, the authors have phrased this in terms of spirituality impacting psychological flexibility. I kind of see it the opposite direction, but I suppose you could argue things either way. It just depends on how you're understanding spiritual practices. And they mention that later on as one of the limitations in this study, because they talk about spirituality as belief in a higher being. That's not necessarily the case for, I would say, most individuals in terms of how they understand things for spiritual practices. Okay, so current study, basically what they did was they gave a number of measures for individuals who were 18 years old, have autism spectrum disorder. It's confirmed by SFARI, which is, let me see here. It's just one of the, here it is, Simon's Foundation Powering Autism Research for Knowledge. Or I'm sorry, Simon's Foundation Autism Research Initiative. All right, so they screened out. I was wondering about what this criterion was for. I suspect it was to screen out for like severe functional or severe intellectual impairments, because maybe that would confound the data a little bit. So they're looking for a very specific subset of autism spectrum disorder diagnoses here. They measured the different constructs they were interested in looking at with a variety of screeners. Now, we could talk about each of these screeners and where the limitations are. There are quite a few. The main one was the valuing questionnaire. So this one is good at looking at values within psychological flexibility. It's not so good at looking at all of the constructs for psychological flexibility. It is also not validated for autism spectrum disorder. So I thought that was an interesting choice, but at the same time, we have to give some leeway because this is the first study of its kind for autism spectrum disorder. And on top of that, we don't really have any screeners or any psychological measures that work well for autism spectrum disorder. And beyond that as well, psychological flexibility as a whole, we still don't have a completely agreed upon measure for what to use, even for the general population. So we got to cut some leeway there, totally understandable, but there are some limitations here to note. And then the satisfaction with life scale, that one is kind of old, but it tends to do its job pretty well, is a reason why it's been around for a while. Okay, and then a whole bunch of statistical approaches. I am not going to bother here with those. So we will just jump down into some of the results here. Oh, and I think I skipped over this, but some of their hypotheses for what they expected. Yeah, associations. So they were hypothesizing different things here. I'm not going to read through, but you can look through if you'd like. And let me return to where we were. Okay, so they did not find significant association between both variables for the first one, spirituality and psychological flexibility or inflexibility. They were again hypothesizing that spirituality would be positively associated with psychological flexibility and spirituality could be negatively associated with psychological inflexibility, right? So looking at both sides there, but surprisingly, they didn't find a high level of association there. Now, there's a number of reasons for that. I believe they get into it in the discussion, but perhaps one of the main takeaways here is that spirituality is just not as important for individuals with autism spectrum disorder. Now, in my experience, I don't think that's really the case. I think it might come down to how this article was carried out and how the questions were asked and how the constructs were used. But again, that's what the research is saying here. Okay, second question. They found a significant positive association between spirituality and satisfaction with life. Again, this is not really surprising for the normal population, but it is nice to validate for this subpopulation we're looking at as well. There's even a good body of literature out there to support that our capacity to even have these kinds of things in terms of spiritual practices, religious practices, it comes down to having something for that mental health stability, as well as something to aspire towards in terms of qualities and values. that's perhaps a whole other discussion. Okay, and then some of the latent variable factor loadings here, things they were looking at. I'll skip over that as well. Okay. Yeah, so again, just summarizing what was said earlier, found a significant association between spirituality at T1, psychological flexibility at T2, but there was no significant association between psychological inflexibility and spirituality over time. Finding provides support for the argument that while related, psychological flexibility and psychological inflexibility are distinct constructs and should be treated as such. I believe I went over this in a prior live stream. I'll touch on it for a second here. Psychological inflexibility, we understand relatively well. We understand the components that can lead to psychological inflexibility in terms of the 6-factor model we've talked about before. But the research we have for psychological inflexibility, it doesn't necessarily translate to psychological flexibility. This has been a pretty serious error we've made for the past few decades because we've assumed understanding on what flexibility is based on what we've had for inflexibility. And this is not really the case. They are two distinct constructs, just like the study is mentioning here. Now we're starting to backtrack and correct and get more information on what psychological flexibility entails as well, which is great. Summary of their study here for spiritually minded adults on the autism spectrum, focusing on their spiritual connections may be instrumental in helping them remain focused on living in accordance with what they value most during difficult times, such as when they are experiencing high levels of stress or a mental health condition. Again, this is not really surprising in terms of a finding. It's just useful that they found spirituality is another component that could be helpful for individuals with autism spectrum disorder. But in general, when someone is going through a time of stress or experiencing a mental health condition, we want to look at whatever construct it is that gives them a sense of stability. It doesn't have to be just spiritual. It could be religious, it could be other types of beliefs, it could be certain practices. We want to turn to that when someone is going through high levels of stress or high levels of difficulty. All right, so this is where they did have a connection. Spirituality and satisfaction with life over time is mediated by psychological flexibility, suggesting that spirituality impacts satisfaction with life through increased psychological flexibility, or more specifically, values, which is the one that they looked at through the questionnaire that they gave. Again, not super surprising here. If we take a construct that is dictated towards helping someone improve their mental health, we would expect that that would have an impact between what they believe and how satisfied they are with life. So that, again, makes total sense. All right. And then another thing here, this may suggest that surprisingly, none of these controls are significantly associated with psychological flexibility or inflexibility. This may suggest that among adults on the autism spectrum in the United States, the connections between spirituality, psychological flexibility, and flexibility do not systematically vary across SES and personal characteristics. This had to do with the way that they conducted their study. And again, since we're talking about psychological mechanisms of change, we kind of would expect that these would not vary across other demographic domains, because it's just like a heart attack, right? If you have a heart attack, it doesn't matter if you're rich, it doesn't matter if you're poor, it doesn't matter what race you are. A heart attack is a heart attack. Now, if you get onto psychological mechanisms of change, we would expect something similar, right? Psychological mechanisms of change should be consistent across diagnoses and individuals because they are mechanisms of action. So again, good to see that the research bolsters that kind of finding as well. Okay, so the so what factor, right? This is where things are relatively important because we just carried out a big study, or they did, and we're looking at it, and they found all these different things, but who cares, right? What's the actual implication for research and practice? So, in conjunction with findings from the current study, may suggest that clinicians working with spiritually minded adults on the autism spectrum who are struggling with mental health conditions may find that honing into their client's spiritual beliefs and connections could help the client better accept and find meaning in the challenges that they're facing, including their mental health condition. Yeah, I would say most, if not all, seasoned clinicians, therapists are going to know this, especially during intake. We always should be looking at religious factors and spiritual factors for what it is that helps somebody stay psychologically stable. This is true whether the diagnosis is schizophrenia, whether it's a normal person, so to speak, whether it's autism spectrum disorder. We want to understand all the different biopsychosocial variables that can impact somebody's mental health. Again, it's good that this study found that relationship and indicates, all right, even individuals with autism spectrum disorder, for whatever reason, maybe it's just a face valid, ignorant belief, so to speak, for people who think that individuals on the autism spectrum disorder may not have spiritual beliefs or religious beliefs. Well, this study suggests that they do. And on top of that, we can use that information to help them in therapy. We can talk about those spiritual beliefs. We can talk about those spiritual practices. Now, the way that they understand spiritual information, the way that they engage in spiritual practices, that probably is going to vary for individuals on the autism spectrum. And I believe it was earlier in the article. I forget where it was, but let me see if I can find it here. Yeah, I thought this was so interesting because it's in line with what I see for a lot of the individuals I evaluate and work with. Participants also reported engaging in prayer. This is for autism spectrum disorder, individuals who have that diagnosis. Participants also reported engaging in prayer, but specified that they viewed prayer as a one way line of communication. In other words, they speak to God, but they do not expect a response. That's just so interesting with autism spectrum disorder because it's in line with the diagnostic criteria that we would see for autism spectrum disorder, right? And for myself, when I'm working with such individuals, sometimes I have to really be literal and direct in what I'm asking for because otherwise I might run into challenges. One example, I will often do calculation questions for certain types of evaluations as part of a brief mental status examination. And I might ask them something like, starting from 27, count backwards by nines. And most individuals who I see, they'll go, okay, 27, 18, 9, 0. They'll say it out loud because they know you're expecting that response. But some individuals, especially those who I later diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, if I have enough data that's valid and appropriate, they will be like, okay, all right, I'm done. Well, they won't even say that at the end. They'll just say, okay, and then they'll just sit there. And it's not until I interject and say something, it's, oh, hey, you need to say these things out loud so I can hear them back from you. They're surprised at that. They're like, oh, okay, I get that now. You wanted to hear that back. Instead, they're just kind of doing it. They're not thinking that the response that they're coming up with should be given back to the individual who's asking, right? So that's something that just seems really fitting with this piece here in terms of speaking to God but not expecting a response. And again, does it really matter? Do you need to expect a response? Most people, they send out a prayer and that's good enough for them in terms of mental health. For autism spectrum disorder, they don't really expect a response to begin with. So perhaps just speaking that one way type of communication, that alone is enough. We have to be sensitive to these things when we're working with such individuals because when we put in our own biases and we think that, oh, there should be a two-way communication, then we're going to run into some disconnects there. So, yeah, I thought that was a really interesting finding. Seems to be in line with what I tend to see as well. Yeah, and this as well. Prayer was a psychological or self soothing tool. They expressed little interest in other rituals or practices. Again, we could interpret that in multiple ways in terms of why that is the case. I think the best line of practice is to just ask them and then go with what their response is. All right. And there's limitations to the study as well. I'm going to go ahead and just skip on those for the sake of time because I wanted to spend the last 10 minutes or so talking about why this article is even important to this channel, because this channel is focused on the psychology of awakening, right? Engaging in certain practices to help find freedom from psychological suffering, where those practices are typically labeled as being more spiritual in nature, although it could argue if that's really the case. But whatever, that tends to be the case. That's why I brought this article up here. And yeah, let me just end with this. So, conclusion: current literature suggests that while adults on the autism spectrum may be less likely to identify as spiritual than their counterparts who are not on the autism spectrum, spirituality remains a salient resource for many adults on the autism spectrum. So, again, pretty much what we've talked about. All right, let me switch back and then we'll finish up with the relevance of why we're going into this. Okay, so in terms of the psychology of awakening, it's really easy to talk about the general population, right? Normal individuals, the vast majority of individuals, we can validate things for them. Most of the practices that are available, if not all of them, perhaps not all of them, but the vast majority, it's geared towards the normally developing population. And the main reason I wanted to go over this article was to show that regardless of your diagnosis and regardless of your condition, there is no specific rule out for what is possible regarding awakening, regarding finding freedom from psychological suffering, and regarding putting into practice the things that I cover in this channel. Now, there may be individual challenges, variances, differences, or perhaps even benefits for certain types of individuals. But as far as I can see, there is no definitive rule out for anyone. Again, there might be certain challenges. If you have somebody who has a moderate to severe intellectual disability, it's going to be difficult to understand the nuances of what we're talking about here. However, that doesn't completely rule them out. And to whoever actually listens to these videos and is trying to get something out of them, I want you to know that as well. It doesn't matter what diagnosis you have or don't have, what characteristics you have or don't have. The types of things we're talking about, just like the psychological mechanisms of change, they are rooted in human experience. And we still need to do more studies to quantify how exactly those differ from person to person and diagnosis to diagnosis, condition to condition. But as far as I've seen, there are no definitive rule outs for what you can do and what you cannot do in terms of achievement and putting these things into practice. I say that because certain people might feel discouraged, especially if you have somebody who has a depressive disorder or severe type of anxiety disorder. They might just feel so overwhelmed and think it's not possible, think I can't do it, have that negative bias in terms of how they're interpreting information. I'm just putting this out as a pointer. It doesn't matter what your diagnosis is, it matters how you make use of it and how you make use of the characteristics of what your psychological functioning can achieve or not achieve, right? We might even argue that certain individuals on the schizophrenia spectrum, they might have certain advantages in terms of these practices for the psychology of awakening because their ability to access altered states of consciousness, altered contents of consciousness, they might have a greater access to that information, right? You don't want to just rule them out immediately and say that they're disabled, they have these issues, they can't really think, they're not going to make any progress. I might do that for my next live stream. Instead of going into articles, I might talk about case studies I've had because there's so many interesting ones that have just come across. And I've really come to appreciate that with the individuals I work with. It's really easy to label and throw off what people are saying when they have different types of experiences across the wide variety of what is possible at psychological functioning. But when you really step down and try to understand what they're saying instead of labeling them as hallucinations, delusions, or things that are crazy, things that need medications, when you really try to understand individuals in that way, you realize that they're just doing their best to describe the different types of psychological functioning that they experience. And just because that content is not available to the generalized population does not mean it's wrong, does not mean it's invalid. It means that there's some really useful data here that we should be taking more serious instead of just labeling somebody as psychotic or crazy or off the ropes. We have to look at not only functional impact, but also the types of symptoms that they're having, because that variance gives us very useful information that helps not only the individual with the diagnosis, but also the normal population, because we can see that the brain is capable of many different types of things depending on how it's configured and wired and structured. And if we stick to just studying the normal population, we're going to miss out on that data. So, main takeaway here that I want to get across: autism spectrum disorder, schizophrenia, anxiety, depression, neurocognitive disorders, whatever type of disorder you may or may not have, don't set that as a hard limit on what you can or cannot attain. Again, we need more studies, we need more literature to see where the cutoff is in terms of what is attainable. But as far as I can see, there's no hard limit there. So, and you can see this within disorders as well, right? When we look at intellectual disability, they used to have cutoffs in terms of IQ scores and the severity of your intellectual disability or whether you even met criteria for one. Now it's looking more at adaptive functioning as opposed to an individualized IQ score, which I think is excellent, because when you look at IQ scores, not only are you trying to assess a theorized construct with limited types of tests, you are also quantifying someone's overall psychological functioning in terms of generalized intelligence into the constructs that you have created. These constructs are limited, right? Somebody can be very intelligent in ways that are not measured by the WAIS-5, for example. Um, That's one of the gold standards for measuring generalized intelligence within psychological sciences. So again, we don't want to label anything too closely and adhere too closely to it. We just want to use those as generalized pointers for clusters of behavior and how they tend to manifest over time and how they might have functional impact for certain individuals. So you should never see in my channel that I'm excluding certain people or including certain people based on those characteristics. The things that I teach, I'm trying to do my best for it. It's available for everybody to benefit from. So we'll go ahead and end things there. I don't see anybody here. I don't see any questions either. Let me switch to live chat. Yeah, I didn't see anything. So I'll go ahead and just end things there. But again, if you have any questions even after that, feel free to reach out to me. I think you can do that on YouTube, right? I'm sure you can. But either way, I'll be here next week and so on, and we'll keep talking about mental health, psychology of awakening. And if you have any suggestions or anything you want me to cover in terms of criteria, I'm happy to look at that as well. Just send me any suggestions that you might have. All right, have a good weekend.